Welcome to Channel 24. Colonel Richard Kemp, a former British military commander and human rights activist, is joining us to the studio. Welcome, Mr. Kemp.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I would love to start from the latest news that Colonel Pavlo Palisa, deputy head of the office of the President of Ukraine, said during his visit to Washington that Russia is preparing major offensive, aiming to create a buffer zone along the border, fully seize Donetsk, Luhansk by September, and eventually occupy all of Ukraine's left bank by 2026. From your perspective, Mr. Kemp, does Russia truly have the resources to carry out such ambitious plans?
Well, Russia's been making, I'm sorry to say, Russia's been making steady but slow progress against Ukraine, fighting into Ukraine, certainly over the last few months and probably the last year. Ukraine has done its best to halt them and also, of course, has mounted its own offensive into Russian territory. But I think Russia currently does have the upper hand. Of course, Ukraine has demonstrated by, for example, its masterful stroke against the Russian strategic air flotilla, that it certainly has a great deal of fight in it and can do Russia a great deal of damage. But I think we'll have to see whether Russia can translate its so far relatively slow progress into anything more effective against Ukraine than it has now. I would hope that Ukraine has some tricks up its sleeve to hold Russia back.
Yeah, and what about Sumy region? What exactly is Putin's goals there? Is it really about creating a buffer zone, or is it the beginning of something more? Because what I'm reading in the news, that they are, taking back all the weapon from Kherson region and from Crimea and moving towards Sumy.
Yeah, they want to seize Sumy, of course, and they want to take as much Ukrainian territory around that area as they possibly can. And of course, they can afford to move weapons, etc., from other areas, including from Crimea, because there is no immediate ground force threat to them there. There's nothing that really they need to be doing in those areas in order to push Ukraine, in order to fight Ukraine on the ground, except maybe for commando raids if Ukraine manages to launch some of those. So they can afford at the moment to regroup Russian forces and weaponry from quieter areas to the areas they want to focus on.
Yes. But Mr. Kemp, do you think they actually plan to stop at any point, or they will continue to move forward as long as they will be allowed?
Well, I think there are two issues. The first one is how badly Ukraine can hurt them and hit them and do damage to them and cause harm to them in the way, for example, they did on the in the attack against the strategic air fleet. And of course, if there are more of those sort of operations which bring home the war to the Russian people, so it can't just be seen as isolated to Ukraine and is seen directly as affecting Russia itself, as we saw both in the drone attacks and also in the attack into Kursk. The more of that can happen, the more painful it becomes for Russia itself. That does present a challenge to Putin, and maybe that will cause him to get what he thinks he wants, maybe a limited amount of his ambitions, and then stop. The other thing, of course, that really does need to happen is that the West, particularly the United States, needs to inflict as much damage and harm on Russia as it can. And there are two ways to do that. The first way is by giving Ukraine all of the munitions, all of the weaponry that it needs and that can be provided, and of course the freedom to use those weapons to attack inside Russia itself. And that will be very damaging to Putin. The more that he sees the United States and the West willing to continue supporting Ukraine, and even stronger support for Ukraine, the better. And the second way, of course, is economic damage. Sanctions and other economic action have been attempted since the war began, but they've been relatively limited. They need to be unleashed in full to, for example, to disconnect Russia from the international banking system, to interdict Russia's ghost fleet that it uses to export oil, and to comprehensively sanction Russia in a way that hasn't happened. That, of course, is a problem for the West, because pretty much all of those measures will also be damaging for the West. But I think the West needs now to bite the bullet and accept the fact that, yeah, there is going to be economic damage to the West as well, but it's much harder for Russia, and it will potentially deter Putin from continuing, because, of course, Putin's economy is not in a good shape now, and it needs to be put into an even worse shape.
But, Mr. Kemp, do you believe that the United States can do that damage towards Russia under Trump's administration?
Well, I think one of the strengths of Trump is that he's extremely unpredictable. He's a very volatile character. And if he suddenly decides, as he might do, that enough is enough, he's tried his best to bring about a peace agreement with Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. Russia has refused to do so. It's kind of attempted to mollify him by playing along with it, but not actually being serious. And if he sees that and realizes he's being made a fool of by Russia, then, I think he could easily turn and effectively take his revenge on Russia by providing even more support to Ukraine. And I think that's a possibility. We'll have to see it. I'm not in a position any more than anyone else is to predict what President Trump's mood is going to be.
Yeah, as a lot of experts in Ukraine and abroad saying that if you see the person who can predict the actions of Trump, they are lying. So, yeah, I fully understand your position. Mr. Kemp, many say Moscow is pushing for a ceasefire just to regroup, just to, win the time. How much time would Russia need to reset, rearm, and strike again?
Well, I think the reality is that while it can, Russia will continue to push forward in Ukraine to take whatever ground it feels it needs to be able to say we have achieved our objective here. We recognise there's been a lot of sacrifice on the part of Russians, but we've achieved what we need to achieve in Ukraine, and then maybe accept a ceasefire, particularly if under great pressure from the West. Then, of course, it's again really an unknown how long Putin will need to regroup, reorganize, and strike again. I don't think there's any doubt that once Putin has, if he does, has ceased fire in Ukraine, allowed at least a temporary cessation of hostilities there, then I don't think there's any doubt he will have another go, and he may have another go at Ukraine later, maybe in a year or 2 years or more or less, we don't know, or indeed at NATO territories, like, for example, the Baltic states or Romania potentially. But I think there's no doubt that with his ambitions for a restored Russian empire, he's not going to stop until he either dies or is removed from the office of president. He's going to be a continual threat to Ukraine and, of course, to the entirety of the West, particularly in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, and Mr. Kemp, your recent piece titled "Putin Nuclear Revenge Attack Will Force Ukraine Surrender." These are the 4 ways he'd strike. That was actually, for me and for a lot of Ukrainians, was impossible to ignore. And it laid out in stark detail just how real the threat of nuclear escalation has become and why the West can no longer afford to look away. If Putin truly believes a tactical nuclear strike could break Ukraine's will to fight, how close are we to that scenario from your perspective?
I'm not sure we're close to it. I was really laying out a possibility, and I think it is a distinct possibility. Putin's talked a lot about nuclear retaliation against Ukraine and against the West, and I don't think it's outside the scope of his capabilities or his evil intent to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. I think it's a possibility. I'm not suggesting we're close to that now. It may not even happen, but I think we have to bear in mind those possibilities, and we need to take whatever action we can, or prepare to take whatever action we can if that does happen.
Yeah, but I was thinking maybe you have some insights from someone as a former military commander. You probably have them, some sources.
Yeah, of course. I keep in close touch with what's happening in Ukraine. But again, I don't think it's in a way a bit like Trump. You can't really anticipate exactly what Putin's going to do. Only him in his own mind knows what he will really do. He's certainly frightened the West by threatening nuclear action. And that's one reason why under President Biden and the European leaders, they were afraid to give Ukraine the support that it really needed. They gave enough to Ukraine to defend itself as far as possible, but did not give enough to Ukraine to strike back effectively against the Russians in a strategic fashion. And they could have given more, but they were afraid of escalation. And so it's an unknown quantity. I think it's something that should be borne in mind, but I'm not suggesting that use of tactical nuclear weapons is something that is either inevitable or necessarily that likely. It's a possibility.
And also in your recent remarks, you said Britain should help Ukraine develop its own nuclear capability, and that without it, true deterrence is possible. Is it time to break the global silence around this issue? And what would such cooperation even look like? How do you see this Kyiv and London cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, the nuclear weapons are still a very potent deterrent against anybody. And NATO has its own nuclear umbrella provided by the United States and by the UK. So NATO countries are to an extent shielded by our US and UK nuclear capabilities. France also has a nuclear capability, but those are not currently available for any use except for the direct protection of France itself, whereas UK and US have a broader nuclear shield. Obviously, the effectiveness of any deterrent, including the nuclear deterrent, depends on political will. And of course, if Putin would be afraid of nuclear weapons, but he would be less afraid if he doesn't believe that in the West there is the will to use them. And I think that is a big question mark. But I don't see any reason myself. I think it's unlikely that the US will extend its nuclear shield to Ukraine. I don't see any reason why the UK shouldn't do so in a bilateral arrangement. If it can extend a nuclear shield over NATO countries, then it can also extend its nuclear shield over Ukraine. And I can see that as a potential deterrent against Putin if the UK decides to do so. I'm not suggesting that the UK would do that with its current leadership, or indeed any of its previous leaders. But it's a possibility that I think should be considered. And my proposal was that if the UK is not willing to do that, because of course it's going to involve risk to the UK of attack by Russia, direct attack by Russia against the UK, then the UK could also assist Ukraine with developing its own tactical nuclear in particular capability. Again, that's not beyond the bounds of possibility. Of course, it would be in breach of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but in these circumstances, maybe that's the right thing to do. Let's not forget that Ukraine itself agreed to give up the nuclear weapons on its territory after the end of the Cold War in return for guarantees from Russia and from Western countries. And of course, none of those guarantees have really materialized. So Ukraine, maybe it is the right thing for Ukraine to have nuclear weapons now. And I think Britain would be in a position to assist it with that.